This is an ABC podcast.
Hello, welcome to PM. I'm Linda Mottram. Tonight, Queensland will be open by Christmas to vaccinated travellers from interstate COVID hotspots. Also, deficient safeguards in Australia's Aboriginal heritage laws. A parliamentary inquiry calls for an overhaul after the Juukan Gorge destruction. And coalition tensions deepen with no deal yet, despite a second day of National Party climate talks. So what price in taxpayer dollars will they extract for their support?
This would cost billions of dollars and it would almost entirely transport coal. So the idea of demanding a new coal railway as the price for your signing on to improved climate targets is a pretty cynical action in my view.
Welcome to the program. Queensland has taken great pride in the state's low COVID status, with long periods of tough border closures key to keeping the virus at bay. But today, though its vaccination rate is still a little lagging, Queensland has announced it is joining the reopening trend. It'll be done in time for Christmas, no later than the 17th of December, by which time health authorities hope the state's vaccination rate will be close to 80%. Long-suffering separated families and the Sunshine State's tourism operators are relieved. In Brisbane, Rachel Mealy reports.
The Queensland Premier described today's announcement as good news, but for Kim Richin, it's still not good enough.
Highly disgusted of living in Australia. I don't tell any of my family members who live overseas now to come here because it's like a blooming prison.
Kim, her husband and her 15-year-old son are relocating to Queensland from Victoria. They've bought a house in Bundaberg and they've got jobs to get to, but Queensland won't let them in. They're stuck in a caravan on the Queensland border near the town of Boomai. She says they're running out of money and can't wait 9 more weeks to get in on the 17th of December.
We weren't expected to be homeless, jobless and stateless, because that's what we are. And now, because we only had so much money put away to tie us over until we got to our jobs in Queensland, well, that's just about gone now. So now we'll have to apply for the dole. We haven't been on the Centrelink payments for over 25 years.
The Queensland Government's plan says once the state has reached a 70% vaccination rate, fully vaccinated travellers can enter Queensland by air if they've had a negative COVID test in the past 72 hours. But they'd have to quarantine for 14 days at home. Then, on the 17th of December, vaccinated travellers with a negative test can enter by road or air and they won't have to quarantine. The Premier, Anastasia Palaszczuk, says the state has always taken a measured approach.
And I think Queenslanders would acknowledge that that is a sensible and cautious approach to ensure that families can be reunited, but the people coming into Queensland will have to be fully vaccinated.
On current projections, Queensland's expected to reach 80% double vaccination by the 17th of December, but the Premier says the reopening might be brought forward if that target is met before then. But she says even if there's a slowdown between now and then and the target's not reached, the state will still open on that day.
That December 17 is locked in. It is locked in now, and I'm quite confident because, we are going to drive this and make sure that people get vaccinated. We're going to do whatever it takes to get people vaccinated.
Queensland's Chief Health Officer Jeanette Young says modelling shows that the Queensland health system will cope with the demand.
I was confident we could cope at the start of the pandemic, and we didn't have anyone vaccinated then and everyone was at risk. So I'm absolutely confident we would be able to cope with people vaccinated.
For Queensland's tourist industry, today has been a long time coming. Daniel Gushfind is the Chief Executive of the Queensland Tourism Industry Council.
With certainty and some schedule is what we've been asking for and calling for. At least it gives us as a community something to aim for, that is the vaccination rate. And it gives us something to aim for as an industry to get ready, prepare for what apparently now will be a Christmas that we can celebrate, not just as families, but also as an industry. And that's what we've been wanting. And I think that is a reasonable schedule to aim for now.
Steve Edmondson runs a charter sailing company on the Barrier Reef.
Yeah, we are excited. Bring on 2022. This timeline now really sets us up to keep that momentum going, to go through what could be quite a prolonged period of doldrums or drought in terms of job security, and that's what we all want.
Tourism operator Steve Edmondson, based in Port Douglas. Rachel Mearley, our reporter there. Well, Hobart and southern Tasmania will emerge from lockdown this evening after a brief but costly COVID scare. And like Queensland, Tasmania is also looking at opening borders with Victoria and New South Wales as the nation awakens from the pandemic. International travel is inching closer as the borders tumble, just as scientists say they've found a more reliable way to detect COVID-positive travellers. Rhett Burney reports.
After dodging a COVID outbreak, Tasmanian Premier Peter Gutwein declared the 3-day lockdown in Hobart and the state's south over. But not everything will go back to normal just yet.
So masks will apply indoors and outdoors for anyone 12 years and over, unless in your own home or in your own vehicle driving either by yourself or with your immediate family. Importantly, if you visit someone else's home, you must wear a mask.
Masks will also be required at schools, a first for Tasmanians. Restrictions on visitors to aged care homes and hospitals will also stay in place, with both rules to be reassessed later this week. So, with 0 new cases detected in the snap lockdown brought on by a COVID-positive man who fled quarantine, was it worth it? Public Health Director Dr Mark Veach says absolutely.
It's one of the paradoxes actually of preventive measures generally. Not everybody who has high blood pressure will have a heart attack or a stroke, but we put measures in place. Even, I hesitate to say it, not everybody who smokes will get lung cancer, but we don't recommend that people go out and smoke. So we sometimes take measures to prevent adverse outcomes at a population level.
Peter Gutwein is also facing a paradox of his own when it comes to reopening his state's borders with COVID hotspots like Victoria, which today recorded more than 1,900 new cases, and New South Wales, where the daily new infection rate continues to steadily decline.
Later this week, we expect to still be able to communicate Tasmania's roadmap in respect of the reopening of our borders, especially to those states of Victoria and New South Wales, and also the ACT.
And while those plans are progressing, so too are moves to open up international borders. New South Wales travellers remain at the front of the queue when the state abolishes mandatory quarantine next month. They'll need a vaccine passport proving they've had 2 doses and must return a negative result before getting on their flight home. But is the latter the most reliable way of detecting a positive passenger? Dr Paul Birch is from the CSIRO. He led a study that analysed wastewater from several Qantas repatriation flights.
And in this case, in this more intense study, we detected positives in 24 of the 37 repatriation flights. That would be about 65%, which did show a positive signal for the virus. And keep in mind that all passengers on these planes tested negative. And so when those planes arrive and we look at the wastewater and find positive, then we were able then to go back and look at clinical testing of individuals.
He says analysing wastewater from arriving international flights would help detect new cases and prevent the virus's spread, and he thinks it should be done on cruise ships too.
Typically, people begin to shed the virus in their feces and in some cases their urine 2 to 5 days before showing symptoms. There'll be other potential uses as well. Like, for example, on cruise ships, you may know that other viruses oftentimes cause significant outbreaks of disease on cruise ships.
The CSIRO's Dr Paul Birch. Rhett Burney with that report. Well, urgent changes have been recommended to the treatment of Aboriginal sacred places in a long-awaited investigation into the destruction of Juukan Gorge in the northwest of WA. They include more Commonwealth oversight and greater powers for Aboriginal people at the negotiating table. It's nearly 18 months since mining company Rio Tinto provoked international outrage by blasting the 46,000-year-old site. But even after all the pain in the inquiry, it's still the federal government that will decide what happens next, and that's at odds with what many Indigenous organisations have campaigned for. Matt Bamford reports.
It was recognition of the pain that cannot be fully healed.
Loss of cultural heritage diminishes the heritage of our nation and deeply wounds the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples from whom this heritage is sacred. The destruction of the 46,000 plus year old Juukan Gorge rock shelters in May 2020 caused immeasurable cultural and spiritual loss.
Today, MP Warren Entsch, chair of the parliamentary committee investigating the destruction of Juukan Gorge, outlined a path towards preventing future disasters.
Such changes will bring deserved protections to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's cultural heritage and ensure that the world's oldest living culture continues to thrive.
The report, called A Way Forward, makes sweeping recommendations to change the way Australia treats the cultural sites of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. They include new legislation to give the Commonwealth overriding powers in heritage matters, including that the Minister for Indigenous Australians take carriage of federal Aboriginal heritage legislation instead of the Environment Minister. There should also be a national framework for cultural heritage protection, co-designed by Aboriginal people, and changes to the Native Title Act to give Indigenous Australians a bigger seat at the negotiating table with those who want to use their land. For fellow committee member MP Warren Snowden, the investigation revealed a culture of exploitation operating within WA's mining industry and a weak legal system that put Aboriginal people at a distinct disadvantage.
What the committee uncovered was the historical abuse of power by the mining industry in Western Australia, enabled by Western Australian law to effectively corral, ignore and override the rights and interests of traditional owners and to use every legal trick to do this.
The company at the centre of the scandal, Rio Tinto, has already paid a price for its conduct through the resignation of several senior executives, including its global CEO. In a statement, the company said it welcomed the report and is working hard to rebuild trust with traditional owners. Jamie Lowe from the National Native Title Council says it's now time for action.
I think that, states and territories and the Commonwealth Government needs to understand that, the time is now. The time is now to act. Protection of heritage doesn't mean no development. It's an important key point.
While Juukan's destruction brought the issue to international attention, the fight over the fair use of Aboriginal land is going on across the country.
So we know the battle continues to be had on the front line with our people. You'd hope the recommendations have some sort of teeth and some sort of authority to enforce not only companies but legislative change. But we know that although the recommendations are there, it's another thing actually getting government and companies to take these on board.
As the federal government considers its response to the findings, Jamie Lowe says Aboriginal people need to be at the centre of the decision-making process.
I think the primary thing is that First Nations people need to be in control of their heritage. That doesn't happen across the board in all jurisdictions, let alone here or Noongar country in WA. So that needs to be the number one priority.
Jamie Lowe from the National Native Title Council, our reporter there, Matt Bamford. You're listening to PM on the radio, the ABC Listen app and via the podcast. I'm Linda Mottram. On Twitter, I'm at Linda Mottram. Ahead, a new Chinese military test is reported, alarming observers. It appears to mark a new phase of an arms race with the US, centred on nuclear weapons delivery. What are the implications?
The Chinese and the Americans have no nuclear arms stability or arms control discussions history between them, no agreements between them, and that means the risk of misunderstanding and escalation is going up.
Federal Parliament has resumed for the final time before the Prime Minister flies to Glasgow in Scotland for climate talks, considered crucial if human-induced global warming is to be brought under control. But today, rather than locking in a 2050 policy to take to that conference, Scott Morrison threw overboard the idea of a more ambitious interim target for 2030. That's because the National Party is still mulling over the proposed plan as they openly use the moment to push for billions of taxpayer dollars for regional Australia to sweeten the deal, and Barnaby Joyce warns the Prime Minister against trying to ram anything through. David Lipson reports.
A fortnight out from the COP26 talks in Scotland, and the Prime Minister's briefcase is looking rather light, without a settled climate policy to bring to the table.
Questions without notice, the Leader of the Opposition.
So in Parliament, it was easy pickings for Labor leader Anthony Albanese.
On bushfires, the Prime Minister said he didn't hold a hose. On vaccines, the Prime Minister said it wasn't a race. Now the Prime Minister isn't even in the room while the government's climate change policy is being determined by the National Party.
The Prime Minister's response, seemingly aimed at his coalition partners, highlighted it isn't the public who needs convincing, with some 80% of Australians supporting a 2050 net zero target. Rather, it's a handful of MPs in the Nationals Party, some of whom are dead against it, others who are still mulling over the pathway to get there.
This government will stand up for rural and regional Australia every single time, Mr Speaker. With the challenges that we face, this government, Mr Speaker, will understand those concerns. We will respond to those concerns, and we will ensure that we have the plans to ensure that they can look forward to a future with confidence.
Those plans now won't include any more ambitious 2030 greenhouse reduction target, after the Nationals leader Barnaby Joyce bluntly confirmed it wasn't supported by his party.
We don't. So there you go.
Yeah, so that's unlikely to happen?
No, well, we just don't agree with it.
The irony here is Australia will almost certainly beat the 26 to 28% reduction target set by Tony Abbott, with states representing about half Australia's population pledging a cut of 50% by 2030. Regardless, the Nationals are holding out. And regional independent Helen Haynes wants to know why.
The government is reportedly offering tens of billions of dollars for regional Australia as part of a climate policy deal with the Nationals. Will the Nationals secure any of this, or will you squander this once-in-a-generation opportunity for us?
The Deputy Prime Minister denies he's asking for a specific amount of taxpayer investment for the regions.
There is no number that we have in any package. I want to dispel this notion that there's some magical number running around. There is not.
But once again, he left little doubt he is holding out, at least in part, for greater funding of pet regional projects like Inland Rail.
You've talked about investments to take the standard of living ahead. And that's why the biggest investment project in this nation is the Inland Rail, which is taking the lives of people ahead.
Construction's already started on the 1,700-kilometre rail line from Melbourne through inland New South Wales to Toowoomba in Queensland at a cost of around $15 billion. The government's also commissioned a $10 million feasibility study on extending it through coal country to the port at Gladstone. Barnaby Joyce last week suggested approval on that was as good as done.
I think you can almost book that in. I mean, you can book that in.
Well, as regional members, we should be arguing for more funding for infrastructure projects every day.
Outgoing Labor MP Joel Fitzgibbon can't understand the Nationals' negotiating tactics.
It's somewhat passing strange that they'd be arguing for funding as a form of compensation, because to do so is to suggest that the government's policy will do economic harm in the regions.
But those pushing for stronger action on climate change have more fundamental concerns.
Yeah, look, I'll be fascinated to see what the rest of the world makes of it.
Rod Campbell is Research Director at the Australia Institute, a progressive think tank in Canberra.
The prospect of upgrading rail infrastructure between Melbourne and Brisbane isn't necessarily a bad one, although there's a lot of valid concerns about economic viability of it. What's the big problem is extending that to Gladstone. This would cost billions of dollars and it would almost entirely transport coal. So the idea of demanding a new coal railway as the price for your signing on to improved climate targets is a pretty cynical action in my view.
Rod Campbell from the Australia Institute. David Lipson, our reporter. Well, it's emerged that just days before her shock resignation from New South Wales politics 2 weeks ago, the former Premier Gladys Berejiklian was called before a private hearing of the state's Independent Commission Against Corruption. She was grilled about whether she suspected her former lover, a former government MP, of potential corrupt conduct when she demanded his resignation in 2018. She insisted she didn't know what to think. But today, as the ICAC began public hearings into the matters that led her to quit, the Commission was told it must now consider whether Gladys Berejiklian's evidence should be accepted. Nick Grimm reports.
I've had to make an extremely difficult decision overnight, but one which I feel obliged to do.
When Gladys Berejiklian resigned 2 weeks ago, she was adamant she'd done nothing wrong.
I state categorically I've always acted with the highest level of integrity.
And in the weeks before that, she'd been quick to shut down questions from the ABC at her media briefings about the ICAC scrutiny into her affairs.
Are you under investigation by the ICAC, Premier?
As I said, as I always say, that is a matter for the agency to do their important work, and it would be inappropriate for anybody to comment publicly on that work.
But in the days between those comments and her subsequent departure from state politics, it's now emerged the former Premier had been called on to participate in a compulsory examination by the ICAC. In video played to a public hearing, Ms Berejiklian was asked repeatedly by Counsel Assisting Commission Scott Robertson whether she suspected her secret boyfriend of several years, the then government MP Darryl Maguire, had potentially engaged in corrupt conduct.
I didn't know. I was in shock. I didn't know what to think. I didn't have enough detail. I hadn't read what was happening. I can't remember what I thought at that time.
Let me ask it precisely. As at the time that you asked Mr Maguire for his resignation, did you suspect that Mr Maguire had been engaged in corrupt conduct?
I didn't know.
I'm not asking whether you knew. I'm asking whether at the time you asked for Mr Maguire's resignation, you suspected that he may have been engaged in corrupt conduct.
I didn't know. I wasn't sure.
After playing that video, Scott Robertson told the hearing that the Commission would need to consider whether it should accept that evidence from the former Premier. The ICAC is investigating whether Gladys Berejiklian breached public trust in relation to the awarding of 2 multi-million-dollar grants to projects in the Wagga electorate that Mr Maguire then represented.
We also expect the evidence to demonstrate that Ms Berejiklian made or participated in the making of decisions and took other steps that advanced the building projects advocated for by Mr Maguire, but without disclosing to anyone within government that she was in a close personal relationship with Mr Maguire at the time that she took those steps. It will recall that during the first public inquiry, both Ms Berejiklian and Mr Maguire gave evidence to the effect that they were in a close personal relationship with each other from at least about 2015, if not earlier.
The Commission will also consider whether the former Premier failed in her duty to notify the anti-corruption watchdog of possible corrupt conduct by Mr Maguire, and if so, did she allow or encourage any such corruption to take place? The investigation is focusing on $30 million allocated to the Riverina Conservatorium of Music, while a further $5.5 million went towards the building of a clubhouse and convention centre for the Australian Clay Target Association. But in his evidence to the inquiry, top bureaucrat and director of the state's Office of Sport, Michael Toohey, said he was surprised by the government's rush to produce an urgent funding submission for the clubhouse project. It was something he described to the Commission as extremely unusual.
There was nothing to go to substantiate the costs or any of those sort of standard work. No risk analysis, no options analysis. The economic analysis was somewhat optimistic, put it that way. And then the business case, the rationale for going forward, it didn't stack up, it didn't make sense.
Gladys Berejiklian is expected to be called to give evidence next week. Meantime, another former Premier, Mike Baird, is expected in the witness box later this week, as is former Sports Minister, now Deputy Liberal Leader Stuart Ayres, and former National Party Leader and Deputy Premier John Barilaro, who, like Gladys Berejiklian, also recently announced his departure from state politics, though in his case for reasons unrelated to the ICAC's investigation.
Nick Grimm with that report. Well, a hypersonic missile test by China marks another step in a growing arms race with the United States, centred on building up nuclear launch capabilities. Beijing hasn't confirmed the test, but Britain's Financial Times newspaper reports that it took place in August. Michael Shoebridge is Director of the Defence Strategy and National Security Program at the think tank, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. I asked him what the test achieved.
We're not completely sure, but it looks like China used a Long March rocket, which they used for space launch for military and civil purposes, to put a hypersonic glide vehicle into orbit. And it looks like that's testing the idea of using essentially a space launch or intercontinental launcher to put another weapon into orbit that can then be used to target many different parts of the world in a very short period of time.
And this is a very evasive technology, isn't it, in terms of potential defences?
Yes, well, intercontinental ballistic missiles, you could see their launch and you can predict their trajectory, but they're still fiendishly difficult to intercept and defeat, which is why billions of dollars has been spent on ballistic missile defence. This is another approach. This is to say, actually, you can't tell from the initial launch trajectory which direction this weapon is going to come from, because it can be launched from different places in orbit.
And this could carry a nuclear weapon or weapons?
That's one of the problems with a lot of the Chinese weapons development, that their systems can carry conventional or nuclear weapons, and they're not keen on disclosing which. So that's a real problem for escalation and crisis management, because it's a very different response you'd give if a conventional warhead is coming your way than if a nuclear warhead is.
So what's the significance of this development in terms of China's military capability and in a climate where tensions are pretty high?
Well, it's part of a large investment in China's nuclear and strike capabilities. China's also developing new nuclear weapons to be launched from its submarines, new air-launched nuclear weapons to be launched from its bombers, and silos for new intercontinental nuclear missiles. So it's already modernising its nuclear triad. This would give it another element. Mind you, the US is not standing still modernising its own nuclear strike capabilities. It's investing about $1.5 trillion updating its own nuclear triad. The big implication of this, though, is that the Chinese and the Americans have no nuclear arms stability or arms control discussions history between them, no agreements between them, and that means the risk of misunderstanding and escalation is going up.
So this is a bit of an arms race going on.
Yes, it is, and I suppose a lesson from history, from the USSR and the US, is this same situation was occurring in the early years of the Cold War without any framework around arms control, verification, or even strategic arms reduction. And it was only crises like particularly the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the Soviets looked like they had actually put nuclear weapons into Cuba. It turns out they did. It's really only the deep shock to both sides that led them over time to build a strategic arms control regime between themselves and really manage the risk of nuclear conflict. We haven't seen that between China and the US yet.
I was going to say, what's the prospect that might happen?
Well, the problem in my mind is that Beijing's strategic culture is all about opacity. And the Soviets and the Americans during the Cold War realised actually their level of destructive capability that they could point at each other meant they had to give some transparency around these issues. And that is so alien to Beijing's strategic culture.
Mm. In the reporting of this launch back in August, we're told that the US intelligence services were stunned by this revelation. Should they have been?
I don't think they should have been. It's old news that China is developing these kinds of weapons, these kinds of hypersonic glide vehicles. It's been in Pentagon reports to the Congress about China's military development since about 2015. Equally, there's been deep congressional interest in US development of hypersonic systems. This pairing is a bit unusual because really ICBMs are still incredibly effective, particularly when they have multiple independently targeted warheads. And hypersonic systems are usually a complementary weapon system, not something that you use a missile launch vehicle to deliver. So that may be a little bit of a surprise, but it just fits with this broad arc of China's growing expansion of nuclear and other strike capabilities against a culture of complete opacity about what they are and how they might use them.
Michael Shoebridge, thank you very much for your time today.
Thanks very much, Linda.
Michael Shoebridge is from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. More of that conversation at the PM webpage. And that is PM for this Monday. I'm Linda Mottram. Thank you for listening. Find us on the PM webpage or on the ABC Listen app or as a podcast. And another podcast for you is The Signal, out weekday mornings, delving into one big story.
You've been listening to an ABC podcast. Discover more great ABC podcasts, live radio and exclusives on the ABC Listen app.